Hello and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, everyone. Hello, Cormac. How are you?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Are you reeling with shock from the news from the Federal Trade Commission?
I'm not so much reeling with shock of that. I'm reeling with the shock of investors who are reeling with shock, if you like.
And just for listeners who weren't necessarily abreast of the story, we're actually referencing the US Federal Trade Commission's legal complaint against Sanofi's proposed licensing deal with Maze Therapeutics concerning a drug that's only completed phase 1 trials for a rare genetic disease called Pompe disease. Basically, Sanofi controls the market. It essentially, at the moment at least, enjoys a 100% market share in the US, which is the most lucrative market for these types of therapies. There is actually a new drug, a combination treatment from Amicus Therapeutics, recently gained FDA approval at the end of September. So the commercial launch, I guess, is only happening right now. And that in itself actually doesn't pose a competitive threat to Sanofi's monopoly, because it's actually approved for patients whose status isn't improving on enzyme replacement therapy. It's a sort of a second line therapy. So the FTC decided in its wisdom that this transaction between Maze and Sanofi would essentially help to maintain Sanofi's monopoly and deny patients the possibility of competition from another entrant in the marketplace. The sort of biotech cheerleaders slash commentators were up in arms about this because they saw the transaction representing business as usual. This is what happens in the biotechnology innovation ecosystem. Small innovative companies with interesting therapies routinely sell their wares to big pharma companies, and the obvious target for these types of transactions is always somebody who's already present in that marketplace, because they know how it works, they have the commercial infrastructure to address that market, etc., etc., etc. And these types of deals are pretty commonplace.
And it's interesting, and I'll try for the moment to be unusual and present both sides, just as you have, Cormac. You can see from the investors in Maze and in most other smaller biotechnology companies, this is the lifeblood of biotechnology, that smaller companies get either acquired or sign a licensing deal or do a transaction with a much bigger company. And as we talked about just a few minutes ago, who knows Pompe disease better than Sanofi? I mean, because with the Genzyme acquisition, they've effectively brought two products to the market, and physicians know them because they're providing the only symptomatic therapy that gives relief to this terrible inherited disease to the patients. Also, look at the side of Maze. If you wanted a partner, if you said, right, I'm developing this product, and I don't know about Pompe disease, but I think it works in Pompe disease, who would I like to partner it with?
Mm.
Obviously, it would be Sanofi, right? Because they own the market.
Mm.
But I can also see the side of the FTC, because particularly US consumers have got a lot to thank the FTC for. They're stepping in on rubbish fees or spontaneous fees by not just Airbnb, but hotels and airlines that put fees on top and think of imaginative new names just to charge people for not doing anything. So the FTC's got a lot of clout and it's got a lot of public support. So on both sides of the arguments, there are valid views. I think in this particular transaction, and a number of others have come before it, so let's come back to this specific transaction in a minute, but there have been a history in recent times, and I guess that's what people are worried about. If the FTC is starting to take more action in transactions between biotech and pharma, then that lifeblood of biotech is starting to be not cut off but constrained. So some of the big transactions in the past, Pfizer has just closed a deal to acquire Seattle Genetics, the ADC oncology company. And earlier on in the year before that deal was announced with Pfizer, Merck was announced as the suitor of choice, obviously because Merck's got a much bigger arguably better oncology franchise than Pfizer. And it's growing, unlike Pfizer's oncology franchise, which seems to be withering by the quarter and floundering. So you can see why the FTC might have stepped in with Merck, although there's no confirmation of that.
But yeah, and there's plenty of competition, obviously, in the oncology marketplace.
Yeah, and this is something that I was trying to remember what that constitutes a monopoly position. It's not close to 100. I think it's even if you had 20% of the market or something, then that's getting close to be anti-competitive. But the Maze deal is much more than that.
Yeah.
And Merck plus Seattle Genetics or Seagen would have been much more than that as well. And of course, that would bolt on to a growing franchise. So I think if the FTC did have a word with someone at Merck to say, oh, hold on a bit, these rumors are going to be resulting in us taking a cold hard look at this, then probably they did Pfizer a favor, because Pfizer more this week than any other week in the last 52 weeks or even 3 years, Pfizer needs those bolt-on sales.
Is there, though, an argument to be made that they were anticipating anti-competitive behavior on the part of Sanofi, but given that this is not actually a commercial product that has FDA approval, it is an R&D program that is progressing through clinical trials, that potentially they could maybe force Sanofi to take action later on in the development life cycle, such as, for example, if the drug did gain FDA approval, then the FTC might require Sanofi to divest one or other of its products in order to encourage innovation. Because right now, we're in this kind of interregnum period. We don't know whether Maze will be able to secure another deal or not.
True.
If it doesn't secure another deal, it's unlikely to be able to raise the financing itself to take this all the way to approval, especially given the current financial state of the marketplace. And I'm wondering, is that sending out a kind of a negative message to innovative biotech companies that you have to be very careful what markets you operate on? Because don't forget, this is an orphan designated product, or these are orphan designated diseases. And there were incentives put in place to encourage companies to engage in these areas because of the very low patient numbers. And therefore, it's kind of very difficult to develop drugs that are commercially successful on the usual terms. Is Sanofi being penalized for the fact that it's made a commitment to the Pompe disease space? I mean, that's one way of phrasing it.
Yeah, and I think there are 2 points here. The first one is Pompe disease, or the therapeutic treatment of Pompe disease, is not like the products and the indications involved in either Amgen's acquisition Horizon or Pfizer's acquisition of Seattle Genetics. They own Pompe disease at the moment. And I think a Machiavellian thought might be that if the FTC are worried about what Sanofi might do, not just now, but in the future, in a year or two's time. So they could, it's possible you could design a clinical trial to make that molecule fail in development and then drop it, or some other reason, like Pfizer did when they bought Aspirion. We can't make the product now, so we're dropping it, and it never seen the light again. So potentially, if you have control,
I'm sure Pfizer might phrase it differently, but
yeah,
anyway.
I'm sure. They're American, right? So they probably don't use that word. But so theoretically, if you have control of the indication and a new product, you can decide what happens to it. Obviously, with the best will in the world, Sanofi would want that product to go on and replace and augment their existing Pompe franchise, which goes back to the FTC's original monopoly concerns.
And look, I'm sure Maze, the people who run that company, are not naive idiots. Like, they're clever people. And most commercial licensing deals will have all sorts of clawback provisions if Sanofi decides to sit in the program or doesn't progress it properly. And if Sanofi behaved egregiously, I'm sure Maze would have some sort of clawback facility. I'd be amazed.
And I'm sure they didn't, right? Because they signed a deal to explore a partnership before they actually did that transaction that the FTC's now stepped in. But I think you may be giving management of Maze a little too much credit, because the executives in biotech companies have a lot of stuff to think about: clinical, regulatory, commercial, funding, that sort of thing. And if you think, you've also get a lawyer in and talk about national security implications or FTC implications, then that's probably one step behind, which most companies are, unless they've experienced before. But I think, coming back to your previous point, one of the aspects is that, sure enough, the partner of the Maze product for Pompe disease won't now be Sanofi. But any other company with some money and some interest, who knows more about Pompe disease than Sanofi? If they've endorsed that product, then they've done a lot for another company. They've done a lot of your hard work for you. The transaction between Maze and Sanofi sort of suggested that Sanofi thought this product could work. Coming from the industry leader, that's a great endorsement for any other company that would step in now and might be able to license it as well.
And what's kind of up for grabs is $1 billion plus product franchise. I mean, the third quarter sales of Sanofi's old enzyme replacement therapies, variously called Myozyme or Lumazyme, depending on which patient population they were approved for. That hit 255 million euros in the third quarter. And then its next generation product, which is supposedly modified to improve cellular uptake, they call it. And I curse the marketing people. They different names for different markets. I mean, they already have a brand and a generic name, but then let's have two brand names. So in the US, it's called Nexviazyme, and in Europe, it's called Nexviazyme. I mean, what's a Z and a D between friends? I mean, honestly, you just wonder what the hell is the point there. Anyway, all that aside, this one got 58 million euros in Q3 sales. It was approved more recently in August 2021. But I know that Sanofi is aggressively trying to switch patients over to it, even though I think the pricing is the same. And the pricing is high. I mean, it's for adults, I think they're at over $750,000 a year, which is a lot of money. And there's about, I think, 1,000 patients on treatment in the US, if I remember correctly. That doesn't seem to add up, actually, when you do the math. It probably does, actually, roughly speaking, because the pricing is lower, actually, for pediatric patients. So those kind of prices put a very interesting ceiling, because these are enzyme replacement therapies. So they're biologic drugs that are made in some sort of a cell production system. The oral drug that Maze was developing, it has a different mechanism entirely. It's not replacing the enzyme that's missing due to genetic mutations. Instead of being an enzyme replacement therapy that you're supplementing something that's absent, you're actually putting in an oral, that's you take a drug by mouth, and it inhibits glycogen synthase. And just for people who are not up in the biochemistry of the disease, basically Pompe disease arises from the absence of an enzyme called acid alpha glucosidase, which breaks down glycogen into glucose. And in the absence of that enzyme, you get these glycogen accumulations, which are deeply damaging to the patients in multiple tissues, especially cardiac and lung and skeletal muscle, I believe. And it's a terrible, devastating disease, and it affects them in multiple ways and usually leads to early death as well, as far as I'm aware. So the clever twist that Maze was doing is that they are not placing the lost enzyme. They are doing something called substrate reduction. So that glycogen synthase makes glycogen from subunits of glucose. So they're trying to sort of push the equilibrium balance away from glycogen accumulation. Now, the obvious no-brainer for anybody is that you would like to combine the two therapies, wouldn't you?
And that's what's been happening with, I think, Amicus's drug. And in fact,
different though. But the Amicus drug, that's not a substrate inhibitor. That's actually there to just, I think it just stabilizes the enzyme.
Yeah. No, I've been trying. You can help me here because your vocabulary is obviously better than mine, Cormac. I've been trying to think of the word that describes Amicus's drug. They've got similar drugs, oral drugs in Fabry's disease, but do you remember
chaperones type of
chaperone? That's the word. Yes, they're chaperones.
I visited Amicus in Cranbury, New Jersey, many years ago, and I met their very impressive CEO, John Crowley, who's just jumped ship to join Biotech as their CEO. And his story, it's a sidebar to this story, he was the person on which the character played by Brendan Fraser in that movie Extraordinary Measures. Because basically, John and his wife Aileen, two of their three children have Pompe disease.
Yeah.
And he had no background in biotech whatsoever. And he started this company because he wanted to try and find a cure for his children. What an extraordinary, noble endeavor. And of course, ERTs are not cures, unfortunately.
But I mean, they are the best drugs out there. If you can find an inherited disease that responds to an ERT and it can be given effectively as a drug, then, I mean, again, I hesitate to use disease modifying, but certainly progression modifying is what it does. And everything else, including the Amicus oral drugs for these types of diseases, they're just pale comparisons, or perhaps even additions to the existing ERT therapy. And again, that may be what the FTC were thinking about when they're thinking, well, okay, this is not a disease progressing modifying drug that Maze is developing, but it would also be a nice add-on to any company that has a big Pompe franchise. So that hasn't stopped Amicus over the years developing its original drugs that aren't as good as enzyme replacement therapies.
But the FTC complaint, from what I've read, a lot of it is heavily redacted, doesn't make any mention of the possibility of combining the Maze drug, MZE001,
Mm.
any of the Sanofi ERTs. And it is potentially something that an academic investigator could do a small scale trial on, potentially, because it obviously, once you establish the safety and efficacy first of the Maze Therapeutics products, that has to be done first, I guess. But it's a no brainer to try to do a combination trial, and you would expect
Mm.
synergies. And you therefore could see that there is potential for innovation arising out of Sanofi's deal with Maze that goes beyond the merits of getting the Maze product to the market. It also includes the synergy of actually having potentially a combination therapy that is much better than either drug administered on their own.
And that's interesting that we settled on Amicus in this discussion of Maze Sanofi, because they're the next most obvious
Good point.
candidate.
And they've just raised $400 million as well.
Yeah, and they've got a history of combining ERTs with small molecule
True. Good
chaperones
point.
or
Good
other
point.
molecules
Good point.
in these types of diseases. So,
True.
and it will be really interesting as the FTC sends around and say, no, you're already there in Pompeii as well. So, no.
Well, that's interesting too. Well, I suppose they have no market share. I mean, you
That's
can't,
true. Yeah.
they would be attempting to take market share from Sanofi, and this would be a very interesting way for them to do so. Maybe Amicus would be the people that would be sending Christmas cards to
Yeah.
key
Well,
members.
yeah, that's true. They certainly shouldn't be expecting any from Sanofi this year.
No, which brings me to another point though about Sanofi and other big pharma companies. I just did a very quick and dirty search on the FTC website to see what other actions Sanofi might have been involved in. And there's numerous ones that some of them are quite historical at this point, but multiple accusations that they were deterring generic competition through various ruses, miswording patent disclosures in the Orange Book, gaming the system. And you could argue that in terms of distorting competition in the pharmaceutical marketplace, delaying generic entrance is much greater effects on patients and on payers than effectively halting early stage deals involving early stage assets.
But on the other hand, if I were a pharma company and I've been in a pharma company, that's an obvious thing for me to spend my money on to prolong that franchise. Just look at how Humira has gone on much longer since it should have done. So I think that's part and parcel of drug commercialization, although perhaps the unkind face of drug commercialization, if you like. But I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about Christmas cards and the FTC. Okay, the space that's left for the Sanofi one on its mantelpiece, they might be getting them from Pfizer even. We talked about Pfizer and Seattle Genetics. And the FTC did step in there, at least to some extent, even though Pfizer got a flag in oncology franchise, to say, no, you divest your anti-PD-L1 monoclonal antibody for cancer that you licensed from German Merck. And I can imagine the oncology people, product managers in Pfizer, they were popping champagnes at that because it's been a millstone around their neck.
Yeah.
It is the lowest selling, it is the worst profile of PD-1 antibodies. So to say, you've got to divest the rights to that.
Even though a lot of companies just want to have their own products so they can do clinical trials without having to get their hands on their competitor product. It just makes it easier to do the trials.
Yeah, in fact, lots of small biotech companies did do that with Bavin CEO, is it called? And it's not generated a lot of sales from it. So
yeah. And also another company that will be sort of following developments, I think, with a certain amount of concern is AskBio, which Bayer is about to acquire. I think they announced the deal on the 26th of October. Because they have, no, I have this wrong. I don't mean AskBio. I mean Arrow Biotherapeutics.
right.
AskBio is one of a bunch of companies doing gene therapy in this area. Again, it's all early stage. Spark Therapeutics is another one, and also Astellas. But Arrow Biotherapeutics is taking a similar approach as Maze. They have, again, a substrate reduction strategy, another glycogen synthase inhibitor, but it's actually based on siRNA rather than so it wouldn't be an oral drug, it would be typically injected. But siRNA drugs are really smart drugs. They're very clever. They're usually, you can get very effective reduction of gene expression. Long-term dosing, 3 months, if not 6 months, is quite typical. It's obviously a modality pioneered by Alnylam and pharmaceuticals in particular. They've made a huge success in the area. And they're just, I think, one of the most innovative little tricks that the biotech industry's come up with in the last couple of years. I think they're
I don't think the investigators at the FTC are sophisticated enough, I might be doing them down,
yeah.
to try and distinguish between therapeutic modality and an
Oh yeah,
siRNA
yeah.
variant
This is
against
just me
another.
going off on one because I'm just an siRNA fan.
Enzyme replacement. And you raised an interesting point, though. But
yeah,
it's not just the FTC.
yeah,
It's not just the
yeah,
FTC you've got to worry about.
yeah.
If you're an international company
Yes.
trying to license a US company or even a
Yeah.
Chinese company, as we saw
Yeah.
with a transaction early on in the year with F-Star. If you're a Chinese company wanting to acquire a UK company
Yeah.
that also then has US operations, and that's going to come up against the FTC. And in the UK, the NSIA, National Security and Investment Act. In the UK, there was when that discussion came out about Maze and Sanofi, lots of people were saying, no, why are the FTC looking at a licensing transaction? Because that's what they were stopping, a licensing transaction between those two companies rather than an acquisition. But the NSIA, National Security and Investment Act in the UK, actually includes licensing transactions. So regulators, anti-competitive regulators around the world will be looking at the FTC's action.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the FTC might also look at the NSIA in the UK and think, yeah, licensing transactions. Let's have a look at Sanofi Maze.
Yeah. And Sanofi Maze and also Arrow and whoever they might want to partner with. And one thing we know for sure, it won't be Sanofi. And it just makes life a little bit more difficult for some startups who are operating in fields where there is a dominant monopoly incumbent. And that's typically going to be in the orphan spaces.
And it's now the classic trade-off this week of
Yes.
biotech investing, because we said that those sorts of transactions, licensing deals between biotech companies and big pharma or big biotech, they're the lifeblood of the technology sector. But also with the patent cliff approaching for the biosimilars, already here for the biosimilars, pharma and big pharma need the biotechnology companies' products as well. So while the need is out there, and the other paradox is that the same with Sanofi Maze. If you want to license your product to the best company in the world, the company that knows the physicians and the doctors and has the channel and the marketing and the R&D and the regulatory experience, then they're going to raise the hackles of the FTC because they're thinking of monopoly positions.
And you're going to get a lower price if you go with somebody else because they're going to have to invest an awful lot more cash to actually build a position in that marketplace.
Exactly what happened with Seattle and Seagen and Merck versus Seagen versus Pfizer.
Yeah.
But does this mean all transactions are off? I
No.
very much doubt it, and I very much hope that. Does it mean that pharma companies that want to bolster their pipelines, that want to get past this biosimilar cliff, are going to have to diversify slightly beyond the therapeutic areas that they're traditionally comfortable with? And J&J, for instance, when asked about what are you interested in corporate development, they say, well, we're only interested in this area, this area, this area. And Novartis say the same sort of thing and should appeal to you because one of them is siRNA. So they might have to become more diverse to sidestep this anti-competitive regulation.
Yeah. So basically, it would help everybody if everybody became a little bit more diversified. But yes, I mean, companies do like to aggregate their expertise and capabilities around key areas. So the whole idea of
there's a lot of synergies there, right? I mean,
yes.
regulators and clinicians
Yes.
speak the same language, and marketing people and reps, like to talk to people who are in the same therapeutic area because you don't want to be a primary care. I mean, and primary care sales forces are dying on the vine at the moment because they had to deal with one product one week and one product the next week. So.
And of course, as I think aloud, though, as well, I'm going to roll back a point I made earlier about combining the Maze Therapeutics product with the ERTs. I'm sure that's going to happen anyway. I mean, they haven't gone into patients yet. They've done a phase 1 on healthy volunteers where they saw that it certainly affected the activity of the enzyme in patients who don't have Pompe disease, or sorry, in volunteers rather. But if you're giving it to patients in America or in wealthy European countries, those patients more than likely will be on ERT anyway. They won't be taking an ERT holiday. It'll be layered on top. So that actually puts paid to my previous point.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think Pompe disease, if it's like any other type of disease, it's one single mutation because these are big proteins that you can get a mutation in the gene, encoded them and it fall. So I'm not entirely sure, but not all patients respond, which is why we have the amicus type chaperones and the Maze type molecules in order that you can have those combination therapies.
And there's infantile onset and adult onset and juvenile onset. And again, that depends on whether or not there's some residual function in the acid alpha glucosidase enzyme or not.
Mm.
But it's one of those stories that has massive implications for the industry, I think.
Yeah.
That's why it's gotten kind of so much comment online. It's not a sort of probably a huge news story for your average punter, but it actually this one's going to be discussed for the next year at every single conference about the industry because
Yeah, in the sector, the FTC will be the Grinch that stole Christmas.
unless in time the Maze product is successfully developed
By another company. Yeah.
and is available at a fraction of the cost of the enzyme replacement therapies. And we will also have the one-off gene therapies coming through, hopefully, which will cost a lot of money, but when set against 750K a year,
Yeah.
even paying 2-3 million for a gene therapy might actually seem like good value. And you throw this on top for hopefully a small price, although I know the pharmaceutical industry isn't necessarily backwards about charging money for small molecules either. Anyways, it's easily genericizable, and the ERTs generally,
Aren't.
the biosimilars haven't chased them because the market's too small. I think there's just no point. And they don't have the expertise either. These are very complicated diseases to treat. So yes, the FTC, is it the Grinch that stole Christmas, or is it the responsible government oversight body that has maintained competition on behalf of patients everywhere?
Well, depending on your perspective, there's no reason why they can't be both.
Yes, and I think maybe time will tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Till the next time, Andy, thank you.
Cheers, Cormac. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.